Stephen, that was very kind, and what better day than All Souls Day, which it is today, to be having a kind of séance with my medieval predecessor of 43 years, Richard Ledrede, from 1317 to 1360. Just before I get going, I would like to acknowledge that there's a certain etiquette in coming back into a place where one once was. And I'm deeply grateful to the Bishop of Castlefurns and Ossory for, as it were, smiling upon this invitation to return. Had we used to each other medieval parlance, I would have said, I know the danger of putting my sickle in another's harvest. And secondly, I am delighted. I haven't been back in Kilkenny much in the last nearly 3 years, but I'm delighted to have this particular opportunity because, as Stephen has kindly said, one of the things I longed to do was to get the Red Book back to the place of its natural belonging on public display for at least a period. And there was a lot of discussion and planning and wondering and hoping, and it is wonderful to see that it has happened and happened so eloquently. Having said that, life throws up its own parables, and just to show how the world moves on, one of the things I do come back to Kilkenny for still is to visit the dentist. There are no dentists in the west of Ireland, it seems. And I was here 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I slipped into St. Canice's to visit the exhibition. And having duly paid my entrance fee, a nice young man at the receipt of custom asked me had I been in the cathedral before. So life indeed moves on. One rapidly becomes history. The Red Book is a personal memoir in many ways of Ledrede's work and varied years in Ossory. And no bishop will ever again be able to rival his 43 years, his survival of pandemic and persecution. And although Stephen doesn't think I'm that like him, in a funny way, in my 16 years here, I found I lived very consciously in his shadow, with a very immediate sense that he was kind of hovering around somewhere. And so, in a way, this talk is a kind of séance on All Souls Day with one's longest-serving predecessor. Before I ever dreamt I would become Bishop of Ossory, I had, however, encountered him previously. I began to encounter him when I was a research student in medieval history in Trinity College, Dublin, under the supervision of that great and good Irish historian, Professor Jim Lydon. And in Lydon's survey of the lordship of medieval Ireland, one of the first books I ever read about medieval Ireland, way back in the 1970s, he describes the Kilkenny witchcraft trial as, quote, a 9 days wonder. And therefore, that was, as it were, how I approached Kilkenny, feeling that there was this strange blip on Ledrede's record, but nevertheless I wanted to know a bit more about him. And the real significance, perhaps, of that burning was that it was so unusual. We heard earlier how even the Templar wicked ones in the Irish context didn't make it to the stake. My friend and supervisor, Professor Lydon, was perhaps biased because he was himself the historian of some of the 14th century archbishops of Dublin, notably Alexander Bicknor, Ledrede's bête noire. You know all the stories of excommunication and fleeing to Avignon and complaining endlessly about each other, as bishops do about archbishops. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But Bicknor was rather Lydon's hero, I think, because of his efforts to solve the problem in Dublin of the lack of a university, which so weakened medieval Ireland, and there was an attempt to do so in and around the collegiate church of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And perhaps ironically, if Ireland had produced a medieval university, it would have had more of the intellectual climate that gave rise to what one might call genuine theological heresy. Bicknor was succeeded by a much more amiable archbishop called John de St. Paul, and interestingly, when he came on a visitation to Ossory in Ledrede's final years, in the aftermath of the Black Death, there doesn't seem to have been any trouble at all. So Ledrede and Bicknor were clearly bishops who enjoyed a good fight. I'm going to mention a few things that entered my mind, indeed my soul, when I was based here, that made me feel somehow Ledrede lived on. First of all, I had 16 years, now followed by Bishop Wilkinson, 16 years of living on the site where Ledrede built the palace. You'll know that possibly largely to establish his own residential authority in Kilkenny after the vicissitudes of his earlier life, in his later years he decided to build the roots of the palace, which is now the headquarters of the Heritage Council. In doing so, like it or not, he demolished a number of old churches in the city, dedicated to James, Nicholas and Bridget. He set up an altar as a reminder of those former churches in the palace chapel. One of the vicars in the cathedral was to go over to the palace to say mass in that chapel, conscious of the dedications to those saints. Indeed, I think cathedral clergy spend far too little time now wandering over to see to the spiritual needs of the Episcopal chapel. Anyway, he built the palace, some of which is still visible, and indeed became more visible during the relatively recent restoration of the palace when the Heritage Council acquired it, and some of the medieval work and the earlier tower house was eventually revealed. I remember Michael Burrows bringing me up to show me triumphantly how a window had reappeared that hadn't been seen for centuries. And the palace became, through and beyond the Reformation, a place of residence for the bishops of many generations, and indeed when the Church of Ireland at the end of the last century took the agonising decision to part with it, and Bishop John Neal, who still lives in Kilkenny, was the last bishop to reside in it, it found a happy future, but not entirely, I can say now, without some measure of contention in the Church of Ireland, given the long history of the place. But one still lived on the site. One lived amidst its ghosts and its memories. And I must say, I found living there, feeling I was in the place where bishops had been since the 1350s, an extraordinary sense of episcopal continuity, which also gave one some perspective on the transitory problems of the present, the 9 days' wonders of my own time. And I didn't expect when I came to live on that site that, and I'll come back to this later, that like Ledrede, who lived through the Black Death, I too would live through a pandemic, admittedly not one that took quite the level of mortality that the one in the 1340s did. Though I can remember the frightening tones of civic life as COVID began, and we sort of put these awful memories behind us now, but I can remember, I'm sure I'm not breaching any confidence in saying it, a terrifying conversation I had with the local authority about would there be enough grave space, particularly if large numbers of people working in the hospital died, and there were graves associated with the Church of Ireland and St. Kieran Cemetery. Could we broaden their use? Could we make them interfaith in cases of extreme urgency in terms of the need for burial? Those were actually quite frightening and dark days. And I used to feel in those days that Ledrede was sort of hovering in the background. The other thing I used to find was, as I say, predecessors give you perspective on your own problems. We don't know what Ledrede looked like. They didn't begin to paint bishops until rather later, but the present bishop's house is full of episcopal portraits, which once hung in the old palace. And I always found being in the presence of those portraits very comforting. I must have had a kind of Harry Potter mentality, I think. But I used to think, perhaps after a little too much worship of Bacchus occasionally, that the portraits would start talking to me. And there was one particular bishop on the way to bed. I don't know where he hangs now, but he was on the way to bed in my time. And I used to think as I went into the bedroom that he whispered to me, "Don't worry, it was much worse in my day." So there was the living on the site. Secondly, I used to love just gazing from the Episcopal chair in St. Canice's across at the monument, of which Turtle Bunbury has already shown you a picture. And there it is on the north side of the sanctuary, the ultimate place of honour, really the burial place traditionally in a cathedral of the founder, which is an appropriate place for him given all he did to make the cathedral as it is. But it's well known, I'm sure you know this, that despite the fact that his effigy has him in pontificals and mitre, that if you look carefully at his feet, you see his bare toes, because he is wearing the sandals of a Franciscan. I always found that very moving. And in fact, I remember at confirmations, I sometimes used in the middle of the service to bring candidates up to look at this. And I would say to them, there's the great bishop who made this place what it is, but he never forgot his origins. And whatever happens in your lives, however important and powerful you become, don't forget the foundations you made by your commitment today. These are things that will stand to you like Ledrede. Don't forget where you came from and keep your feet on the ground. This all seems very different, as you're already discerning, from the pyrotechnic bishop. More broadly, there was the work on the cathedral, particularly done in the quiet later years of the 1350s. Turtle again already mentioned that burnings were fairly minimal and penance was the better option. And so it was that Alice's son, William Outlaw, as part of his penance for the whole carry-on, was obliged to re-lead part of the roof, and as well as that, he was obliged to feed paupers and to endow a priest to celebrate in St. Mary's, now the church on the medieval mile, before an image of the Blessed Virgin which Ledrede himself had made and painted. In addition to making sure that his enemies spent their money feeding the poor and re-leading the roof, he was preoccupied with the aesthetics, and so we know that he created a marvellous iconographic scheme of stained glass which one only longs to feel could still be there. He designed the east window. As a purveyor of sound doctrine, it was emphatically Christocentric, depicting the whole life of Christ. And Daniel Roth, Bishop Daniel Roth of Roth House fame, and I love quoting this lovely Latin word because it's so nice the way it rolls off the tongue. He said that the depiction of the life of Christ in Ledrede stained glass was felicissime. Felicissime. Superbly felicitous. Rinuccini wanted to buy the glass and export it to Rome. We know that the Cromwellians made an end of it. It was replicated subsequently, but could never have been of the same quality. Fragments of it have been found during excavations, particularly as early as the 19th century. But if Ledrede's glass had remained, walking into St. Canice's would be like walking into Chartres. You'd have that extraordinary sense of darkness, and gradually your eyes becoming accustomed to the light coming in and illuminating what you discern of God through the glass. And the amazing thing about stained glass is it is never the same on two different days of the year. And the east window through which the sun rises throws a different light and a different beauty on the celebration of the Eucharist beneath it every day. I'll go off on a tangent here and say, one of the things that makes me mad is the excessive illumination of the interiors of cathedrals and other churches. The whole purpose of stained glass is to study God's light coming through them from the outside, including in the depths of winter. And if you fill the inside, no doubt for health and safety reasons, with huge amounts of light, you will never appreciate the glass. And in Chartres, they still have, at least the last time I was there, this wonderful sense that you blink and try to work out where you're going when you come in on a dark day. But Ledrede's preoccupation with iconography and glass certainly reminded me of the continuing challenge the church must always have to engage with the arts. there is a great danger that because we're so preoccupied with heritage, rightly, and keeping everything going and keeping everything in good order, that we fail to be as creative as our ancestors were. I have asked myself from time to time, when we're dead and gone, centuries ahead of us, what artistic evidence will we leave of the faith that may have motivated, as it were, the Church in a particular generation? Certainly looking at the Church of Ireland, I would have to say not much. And yet, artistic imagination is the midwife of theological development. Artistic imagination is the midwife of theological development. Where theologians eventually get, artists have almost always gone first. And so that moves me on to the songs, the 60 hymns in the Red Book of Ossory, which are so theologically rich, again, as you would expect, full of sound doctrine, perhaps therefore not for the common purpose. As we know well, the purpose of them was that the cathedral clergy wouldn't be singing lewd secular songs, cantilini theatrales turpes, as he put it. And so he wrote new hymns, theologically rich, for them to sing. But interestingly, he knew the favourite tunes out there in the street. And he often gives the first line or two of one of those lewd songs to indicate what should be the tune that the vicars would use to sing their theologically rich hymns. So he wasn't entirely unworldly, and he shared a traditional Franciscan love of music. The songs, the hymns, they focus on doctrinal issues of the time, the place of Mary, and given that he was a Franciscan at the time, his Marian devotion is actually quite mild. Much more emphasis on the centrality of Christ, 25 hymns about the Incarnation, 11 about the resurrection, one alluding to Aquinas on the real presence, a very imaginary encounter with Mary Magdalene at the foot of the cross. Some have allusions that are slightly autobiographical, such as allusions to the transitory nature of worldly greatness and oppression of the Church by its avaricious enemies. And it portrays, as he draws on the songs of the world around, a multilingual Kilkenny, where people sang in English and in Norman French and in Irish and in Latin. I was very fond of these songs before, these Latin songs, before I ever came here, to the extent that when I was Dean of Cork, I used to challenge the cathedral organist, Colin Nichols, every Easter to compose an anthem for which I would provide the words. This is a very good thing for a dean to do, and it was much harder work for the organist. All I had to do was to put the words through the letterbox, and he had to compose the anthem. And this was always most fruitfully done about sort of Wednesday and Holy Week, because if I hadn't given him a very tight time scale, the goods would not have been delivered on Easter morning. And one year I put through the letterbox one of Ledrede's Latin hymns, the one where Mary Magdalene encounters the risen Christ without knowing who he is in the garden on Easter morning. And Colin produced a lovely version of this, which actually was sung at my consecration as Bishop of this diocese in Christ Church Cathedral, Dublin, in July of 2006. And it struck me too that over and above a more SATB version, it was actually capable of being sung to a very ordinary hymn tune. I'm not going to attempt to do it, that might be a bit much, but some of you who know hymns in the Church of Ireland might know the tune of Jerusalem the Golden. But just listen to this, because albeit in Latin, it's so sort of naturally rhythmical. Mary is encountering the risen Christ. She doesn't recognize him. He asks her not to weep and reveals who he is. Maria noli flere, sepulchro Domini, surrexit enim vere sepultus aperi, sepulchra patueri, testantur angeli, ad latus intueri, quem vocas Rabboni. I better keep going. So I've mentioned the site, the monument, the glass, the work on the cathedral itself, the book, the songs, And just to mention again, the extraordinary multilingual city that this was, as one thinks of the Latin of the Cathedral, walking through Irish town up to the castle. The blend of Norman French and English and Norman French seems to have survived here possibly somewhat longer than it did in England itself. And I used to think to myself, as Kilkenny again became in my time so multilingual, when one walked through the street from the cathedral to the castle, one heard so many languages. And I thought, this is like Ledrede's time again. This is a multilingual place. One needs to reach out to those who speak many languages and sing their songs. And I felt with a measure of shame that he who undoubtedly would have been able to speak at least 4 languages was not being at all rivaled by the likes of me, who were hard-pressed to speak 1.5. He was also a great reformer and doer, a lover of synods. And in the ecumenical context, everybody is apparently talking about synodality at the moment. Pope Francis is preoccupied with reinventing synodality as a way of discerning the breath of the Holy Spirit. I hope I don't get quoted. The trouble is being recorded as you get quoted. I was going to say, I hope that he won't look too hard at some of the antics of the synods of the Church of Ireland. But synods, in Ledrede's view, were the great way to get things done. He gathered people to lay down the law, to impose a programme for action. As soon as he'd arrived, we know his views on sound doctrine, the importance of clerical residence, suitable pastimes for the clergy, sound diocesan finances. And as I contemplated when I was a new young bishop of 44 here and how I would sort of set about things, I asked myself, how do you behave as a new bishop? Do you go hammer and tongs like a dynamo like he did? Or are you a slow burner? Or are you, as you get into a sort of long episcopate like I've now done, I'm in my 19th year of bishoping, do you go from being a kind of a naive dynamo who thinks everyone will just do what you say, to being a slow burner who shows a measure of patience, to in the final years then being what one might call an old man in a hurry? So I used to reflect a lot on the pace of pastoring. And some of you will remember my much-loved predecessor, Noel Willoughby, who I didn't quite manage to be here as long as him, whatever about Ledrede, but it used to be said that it took him 3 hours to walk from the palace to the bank, so beloved was he of the whole city. But I remember, I think I could say this now, in my more dynamo days, I remember laying down the law to the diocesan council in Ferns in a way that was quite arrogant, but I was only in my early 40s. And one of them said to me, referring to Noel, "The bishop never spoke to us like that." One of the deeper issues that we have to address in dealing with Ledrede, and this is a sensitive one to mention because I don't know who's listening to me and of what nations, from what nations you come, but he raises fascinatingly that timeless issue of the problem of being English in Ireland. Could I put it like that? The timeless problem and challenge of being English in Ireland. And that would apply the other way around too, I'm sure, if I was Irish in England. And of course, it's a question that, centuries later was wonderfully mused upon by Somerville and Ross in The Adventures of the Irish RM. This sort of focused Englishman who felt he knew what was good for the community, but frankly, they ran rings around him and he didn't even see it. And I think, Ledrede is an early medieval example of that problem. He came from a different academic climate, both in England and in Avignon. Such climates gave birth to intellectual heresy in a way that didn't characterize Ireland, where there was no university. He arrived dynamo-like, convinced that there were heretics under the bed and it was his duty to find them. It would seem he learned sense. But in his journey along the way, he fell, of course, foul of the well-connected Anglo-Irish, and in particular the Archbishop, who he thought was one of the shelterers of heretics. And the Pope in Avignon, where Ledrede was well connected, had some sympathy with him, and did the unprecedented thing of releasing him from the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan until Bicknor was dead. Extraordinary thing to do, upsetting the whole apple cart of how the church functions. And I used to laugh to myself that in my later years here, and I'll say it in her presence, that my Metropolitan happened to be my wife's brother. The Archbishop of Dublin is Claire's brother, Michael Jackson, and I often thought to myself, what could I do that would cause me to need to be liberated from his metropolitan jurisdiction? But fortunately we didn't manage a fight ever. But it's a serious question. How do you come from a different intellectual culture and get the curiosities of Ireland? A very good friend of mine and one of my Tuam predecessors, Richard Henderson, who again came from an English intellectual stable into the west of Ireland and had a wonderfully fruitful ministry there. But I once asked him, was it ever a problem being English? And he said, no, until it was. Arnold Lepore, the Seneschal of Kilkenny, one of the well-connected Anglo-Irish with whom Ledrede memorably clashed, declared that this was the island of saints, and this upstart rustic comes from England and says we are all heretics. And in 4047, a century later, when sorcery was being thrown around as a term of abuse in the Irish Parliament, when they were shouting across the chamber, as it were, that one lot were sorcerers and the others weren't, parliamentary exchanges never change much. In effect, there had to be an intervention, a parliamentary declaration that this was unparliamentary behaviour because there had never been any sorcery in Ireland. Ledrede's personal qualities were many, and some of them I've implied already. His resilience through a long episcopate, which saw him through excommunication, exile, the Black Death, huge resistance. The sheer longevity of his rule. Getting through the Black Death. Dr. Bernadette Williams, who opened last night, will have told you, I'm sure, much about that, and she is the greatest authority in the land on Friar Flynn and his famous annals, which depict what happened in the city and the massive mortality level during those years. We sort of assume that medieval people had no difficulty in believing in God, and that they just assumed all nasty things were divine punishment for some kind of sin. But I suspect people in those days were more human and more vulnerable than that. They must have asked profound questions about this awful visitation of mortality. When Flynn, in his most famous phrase, spoke of leaving behind paper and parchment, pen and ink and parchment, should any of the race of Adam survive this pestilence. And that really goes to the core of human vulnerability. And Ledrede's famous contemporary, Richard Fitzrafe, the Archbishop of Armagh, many of whose sermons survive, they certainly hint at the theological as well as the pastoral challenge of dealing with this calamity in society. And Ledrede must have shown remarkable fortitude and courage during all of these years. As I said, I didn't expect to live through a lesser pandemic in my time here. And one of the things that kept striking me was, I often think on the judgment day, as it were, at the gates of heaven, I speak metaphorically, I often think those of us priests who lived through those years, we'd often be asked in a way why we stood back from so much of what was going on. And the answer, of course, is we had to. The state, rightly, took control of our ministry. We could only do our best through nursing home windows and at tiny funerals attended by 10 people. It'll be interesting to see what the COVID, and it's not an inquiry, is it? It's an evaluation, will make of how mortality was treated and the situation in nursing homes. But I often used to say to myself when I was sort of almost cocooning in the bishop's house in those years and doing everything online, Ledrede and his like, and of course they wouldn't have been let rightly now, but Ledrede and his like would have been out risking their lives where the sick were. It's but a thought. We don't know what he looked like, but somehow the book, nectar and all, leaves us his taste and is his portrait. And I always felt here I lived in the shadow of a dynamo who shared so many issues with me, including human nature itself, which never really changes. And after all those years, Kilkenny was still Kilkenny. And yet perhaps he was at his most creative and imaginative, and I haven't talked about burnings and witchcraft at all, when in his final years he at last studied to be quiet and seems to have lost the need to find a heretic under every bed or simply to have a good fight with everybody. When the bishop who ordained me priest, I once went to seek his advice about a major row I was having in a certain parish involving music. He listened to me carefully and he said words I've never forgotten. He said, "So true, if you want to fight, join the church. And if you want to fight to the death, join the choir." And I speak as an amateur organist in saying that. I just finish with these perhaps two thoughts. I know he did awful things, but I don't rush to judgment. I came here wanting to see the bigger picture, and I felt I lived in the shadow of somebody who made a hopeless error in his dynamo years, but yet courageously did a very great deal of good and left a creative record of it. I preached at my enthronement, I hate the word, but I preached at my enthronement in St. Canice's on Michaelmas Day 2006 on Ledrede, rather in the manner I have just spoken. And I don't often get sentimental, but during the hymn that followed the sermon, I walked over and put a flower on his feet. And ever since then, I say to myself, never forget where you came from and keep your feet on the ground. And secondly, and this really is a final thought, how do we connect all these things to the reality and challenges and travails of the church some of us encounter today? I would like to say, if you want a really powerful thought on connecting all this with present travails, read the Bishop of Cashel, Ferns and Ossory's letter in this month's Cashel, Ferns and Ossory Diocesan magazine, where he superbly connects all of this to continuing violence against women and takes up Alice and Petronella and all of this as an example of how women are scapegoated in a male world and by men who are tempted to violence. Superb. But I'll add my own little additional thought. Heresy, so-called, is, in my view and experience, often the exaggeration of a neglected truth. And in the long term, the so-called heretics may be proved at least somewhat right. And sometimes they have to shout disproportionately loudly in order to make a point that isn't being heard. And so heresy, to use the word loosely, hasn't gone away, perhaps particularly in the moral area of Christian ethics and connection of Christian reflection with the society we're in. Today's heretics, unorthodox people, those whose manner of life might not commend itself readily, those who are called by some to repent, they may be tomorrow's icons of justice. And speaking only for my own church, today's supposed threats to orthodoxies are met with Ledrede's attitudes, if not his methods. The stake may not be available to the General Synod, but harsh righteousness still is. And for that very reason, I don't blame him too much. His harsh righteousness hasn't gone away entirely. And talking of such an attitude and the danger of it being found among bishops, another esteemed predecessor of mine in Ossory, Henry McAdoo, who was proud to be the custodian of the Liber Ruber when it lived in the palace. I remember a marvellous sermon he preached at the consecration of another bishop. And he was talking about the duty of bishops to give moral leadership, but to do so attractively. And he talked about how in Greek, the phrase good shepherd, kalos being the Greek word for good, is better translated beautiful. In other words, you can only give moral leadership if you do so attractively and it becomes compelling and magnetic. And having made that point, he added, almost as a throwaway remark which haunts me, he said, remember that it's possible to be morally upright quite repulsively. Remember that it's possible to be morally upright quite repulsively. Such an attitude, despite all he did so courageously to beautify this city, remains Ledrede's Achilles' heel, and is a warning to those who are nevertheless proud to call themselves his successors.